Professor, thanks so much for taking the time. It's very much appreciated.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Professor, we are in this world now, it seems, where society as a whole is in a better position than it's ever been, right? People, by and large, are in a better position than they ever been on a variety of fronts. Shouldn't that impact whether or not folks are happy?
You would think so, but the research that's been done saying that modern day societies are better than they today than they were in the past are often based on um, aggregate statistics. The rate of crime, um, and these things all touch us, but they're one step removed. And what they're removed from, I think, is the um, personal subjective feeling that a person has that they themselves are truly happy or happier than they were before or happier and compared to other people. So the looking at it at the societal level, I think obscures the what goes on at the phenomenological level. What an individual actually feels and experiences, and there's a gap there. And so, in the end, to be happy is that we have to really feel that ourselves. We have to experience it ourselves, not just see that global statistics show that things are getting better on average. But when we look at things on average, there are people, below average and above average and all over the map. And so it can be misleading doing these global comparisons.
Now, you've written about how several nations have engaged in efforts to try to quantify happiness. How successful are those? Is that possible?
Well, I think it's useful from a first step, and but their quantification is based on a single item, usually one item or two items, and so it's pretty hard to measure happiness with two items. Their items are items that go from 1 to 10. Not at all happy, very happy, um, and when pressed to do that, people will respond. Um, but they're sometimes responding because they know they have to summarize things. They know that the people asking them questions are trying to get at something, and they want to please the interviewer. So it's not very deep. It really doesn't get at the heart of the matter, which is their subjectivity, their feelings of well-being. And that's where the happiness resides.
Now, you've written about the seven elements of happiness. Can you tell me about those um, to the extent that um, you can do so in an organized way in a format such as this one?
Okay. Well, being a professor in the area that I work in, um, I'm required and by nature, um, I look at things theoretically first and try to understand the underlying forces behind things. But I wanted, um, when I written about happiness, I was writing largely for my students, who I've been a professor for 47 years, so I've seen everything. Um, Students of going through depression, interpersonal conflict, physical illnesses, losing a parent, you name it. And I wanted to um, develop a theory-based um, set of criteria that people could look at and develop their own path to happiness. So not my path. And when I generated the seven things, um, they were just seat of the pants and somewhat also following the um, basic research too, that I gleaned, which is often done in a very atomistic sense. Somebody will study one thing often, but looking across the literature, I wanted to have a set of ideas and feelings that people could draw upon, but then could put themselves in place of those and see if they're relevant for them, and if they are, to develop that and develop their own pathway. So those seven things were, I'm sure I've left out some. Some of them maybe not don't apply to everyone, but they're starting points. And I think the first one was, um, having someone you care about and love, and having someone who cares about and loves you, um, which applies to just about everyone and starts, in our young families, with our parents, and in my case as well, with grandparents, because I grew up in the same house as my grandparents for a while. And then siblings and friends and so on. That's the starting point, and that's one of the seven. Um, and then the other six are equally important, but they're quite different. And for students, some of those are probably yet to be developed, because it's just before they've chosen an occupation, or if they have an occupation in mind, before they've really experienced it. So I know the second one had to do with a career or work as a calling. So that work is not just something to make money and be able to provide you with resources to do other things that you might want to do, but in and of itself, work can be deeply satisfying. And of course, students are in school to kind of find out what that future is going to be. So it's hard to probably imagine that and talk about that um, for a 22-year-old student, although they're certainly looking forward to that. But work can be a sense of calling. I use that just as a figure of speech, and that means enjoying what you're doing so much, wholeheartedly, that you really love to do it, and you can't wait to get back to it, or it's a part of you. It's not something that's segmented and and separate from the rest of your life. Um, yeah. So the seven things that I looked at are starting points for people to examine their own goals and values, backgrounds, aspirations, and see how each of those seven might relate to that and help them along that path. And my whole life as a professor was one of um, actually, it's something I picked up from my dissertation advisor, Sidney Levy. And his family, like yours, um, immigrated from the Ukraine long time ago, and he's passed away now. But he was a wonderful professor, and used what he was a clinical psychologist, and he used a non-directive approach. And his goal and the way I developed under him was to find my own way, and he supported the conditions to do that. So once I became a professor, and it was very natural for me to try to do the same thing with students. I really wanted them to learn and grow in the way that was best for them, and I wanted to avoid being overly directive and giving them templates or rules that might have applied to me or other people, but maybe not to them. So I wanted them to develop their own. That's the best way for human growth and learning, I think. And so that's what those seven things. There should be eight or nine, or maybe a couple of them I should have dropped out, but I think it's a starting point. And most people don't take time, especially young people, don't take time, um, to reflect on who they are and why they're there, and where can they be going, and and how are they going to get there, and how they should treat other people, and what life is all about. Um, Usually we're given assignments, even as students, but even on the job, many of the goals are given to us, and we have to, it's part of the job description and part of getting through an education. We have to do those, and that can be overwhelming. So it's not unnatural that people don't think about these things. But in the end, if they're to be happy, they have to at some time. And they have to take time to reflect on who they are and how things are going. how they'd like them to go, how they could do things better, and also to take pride perhaps in how things have gone well. So that's has been my kind of philosophy. And I know it's different. There are, if you look at coaches, and I had many coaches growing up playing sports who were, very dogmatic, authoritarian, and very directive. And that was their style. That's what they believed that human nature was that way and required people to be pushed. And I came from the opposite tradition. So um, Sidney Levy, my um, great professor, I owe everything to my parents. They were very nurturing. So that's the kind of environment I try to use in the classroom and in one-on-one with my students. Yeah. Which means it's not about me, it's about them. It's to help them to grow and become the person they can be. Yeah.
How closely connected are self-awareness and happiness, right? Self-awareness being this idea that you know yourself and you can analyze yourself objectively in an honest way. How important is that?
Well, I think it's very important, but before I say anything about self-awareness, when we're programmed, that is, we inherit when we're born genetically and the way our brains develop, and through early developmental psychological processes, socialization, and as a young child. Um, Anytime things happen to us, good or bad, that we're not aware of that until after often, and we reflect upon it. And those things that happen to us are, contributing to our happiness or unhappiness. Likewise, when we have goals, when we have goals, sometimes we succeed and sometimes we fail. And the success and failure have this automatic, like psychological plus or minus for us. So that's happening all the time, and we're often not aware of how and why that's happening, and we have to take time to become aware. And the awareness, I think, is important because we have to reflect upon, why we're doing what we're doing, and what does it mean when I succeed and when I fail, and what does that mean in terms of my relationships with other people that are important to me or are related to my work. We really can't assess those things without becoming reflective, becoming aware of those processes. And that's a kind of skill that we need to take time to do. And in the busy world that we're all in, the work world and student world, it's much easier to just respond to the pressures that are on us and to kind of lose the self-awareness. We have it at one level, at a superficial level, but to look at ourselves and others more deeply, self-awareness is essential. And that's part of um, uh, looking back on our lives and saying, have I been the person I wanted to be or could be? And that's a part of happiness, this kind of evaluative, but the reward and punishment part is more automatic. And we have to reflect on that as well, because sometimes we can get carried away, um, by certain rewards or bad things. And we have to look at them and think about why am I reacting this way? What is the meaning of this? How does it fit in with my whole life? And that's where self-awareness comes in. And it's essential.
There's a professor named Robert Waldinger who directs the Harvard study of adult development, and his program conducted a study where they tracked dozens of men over the course of a decades-long period, and to assess happiness, right? Men from different backgrounds and socioeconomic classes. And the conclusion that was drawn is that happiness is most closely related to your ability to develop and maintain good relationships with people. Is that something that you found as well?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it probably logically it's possible to be happy if you're live in solitude and don't like people. Um, but then that person in that condition is getting their happiness from not from their relationship to other people, but through whatever rewards that they're pursuing. But the main thing I think about, I didn't know the research that you cited, but the main thing about relationships with others is in terms of what we give to others, helping others grow, not just what we get from others. Of course, we do both all the time. But helping others, that's the meaning of empathy. Empathy is putting ourselves in the shoes of another person, taking the perspective of another person. That's the thinking part of empathy, the cognitive part. But there's a feeling part as well, and that's feeling compassionate concern or empathetic concern for another person, uh, um, caring about other people. That's the feeling part of empathy, and that's a part of everyone, even psychopaths. Um, have some, they're on a continuum, and and they feel some empathetic like responses, although they have a hard time putting themselves in the place of other people. Um, so social relationships are essential. There's a famous study done by the developmental things that you mentioned by the professor at Harvard reminded me of this. Walter Mischel, who was a professor at Stanford, and he moved to Columbia. He did a famous study with children, and I think it was called the marshmallow study. So with young children, 3 to 5 years old, um, I don't remember the details, so I'm going to kind of paraphrase and communicate the principle. But when people are given a chance to children to eat marshmallows, they could eat, for example, one right now, or they could, if they wait a while, they can have two. And some people um, took those, they couldn't wait. They couldn't delay gratification. Other children could, and they got more rewards. So Walter Mischel also looked at people over time, those children that he first looked at in subsequent experiments, 20, 30 years later. And there's some evidence, although there's still a lot of debate about methodology and so on. But there's evidence that the children that were able more or less naturally to delay gratification um, did better. They did better later on their SAT tests. They did better later in their accomplishments at work, and they tended to be somewhat more happy. There's some belief, though, that socioeconomic status is behind that, and you have to control for that. But um, those kind of things, delay of gratification was very important. Um, and is also related to interpersonal relationships. Because, for example, there's a conflict between, for most people, a tension, if not a conflict, between work and family. We're always having to make choices between work and family, and family, of course, is part of our social environment. And how we resolve those tensions and conflicts are very important. Delay of gratification is just one small piece of that. And so, interpersonal relationships are very important. Friendships. There's research done by John Cacioppo, who's neuroscientist, University of Chicago. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he studies loneliness. And, loneliness is the absence of strong social relationships, and really eats into the quality of life, and actually even the length of life that people can live. So, support systems, both receiving and giving support, become more and more important as a person ages, but even as a young person. Yeah, because everybody experiences conflicts. Yeah. So I agree with the social um, elements that you spoke about that the Harvard professor studied. Yeah.
You seem to focus your research on happiness in the context of academia. Why is that?
Well, um, I've had a lot of 47 years plus because
Right.
I was also a student before that, of course. But I've had a lot of fellow students when I was a student, later when I was a professor, who were suffering. I mean, really suffering a lot. And sometimes they come and speak with me. And one student was a schizophrenic, and um, I've had a colleague that was a high functioning autism, um, and many other family issues and problems. And so, the academic world is my world. So I'm seeing students and faculty all the time. And I had this happens every year. And I just thought, well, I want to write something about it because I could see my students, they're so under so much stress and tension, all the assignments that they have to do. And I mean, it's really strong, and they really don't have to take time for exercise and diet and maintaining personal relationships sometimes. And I wanted to write something that would kind of force them to think about that, and something that they would go back to, that would be challenging. It wouldn't be just a kind of superficial or fluff. It'd be kind of deep. And I tried to embed in there literary principles and many other things, hidden things that would challenge them. And so all of this evolved out of my everyday environment, which is, every day I have students. And then it's not just the day of teaching, but my students over the years. I maintain contact with them, and I'm doing research with students that graduated 20 and 30 years ago, and they have families now, and we talk about their families. And so, it was just part of my everyday life. And so it was stimulated, though, by seeing the suffering that my students were going through and trying to give them something to help them. Yeah. I'm hoping that what I wrote might have some relevance for, everyday people. And so I've given it to my wife and some of her friends and gotten feedback. But, um, most of my life has been focused on family, teaching, and research. And I haven't done much on the outside. I saw the 30 or 40 kind of platforms that you listed, that, your career has touched on New York Times and all those other things. And I was thinking, wow, I don't have anything like that. My world is much, much more circumscribed and narrow and simple, and people would probably say boring, I
I
think.
don't think many would say boring. What connection have you found between physical fitness, physical form, and happiness?
I would say that there are at least two connections. Now, um, one connection is simply um, non-goal directed, non-purposive, no purpose in mind, where sometimes people dance or go through certain exercises simply for the joy of the physical movement. And they got into that and were introduced to it, and are experiencing that just for the joy of it. Um, Other people, it's much more a purpose in mind. That they're exercising because they want to live longer or to feel more energy, or to sleep better. So they have many different kind of purposes. So those are the two sides of it. Sort of kind of expressing oneself. It's an outcome, not a goal. Other people may be the same person too. And it's a goal itself, the exercise. And I think exercise has to be tied to diet as well. How we eat, how much we eat, what we eat. Um, you know, interacts with our exercising to make us healthier, make us feel better. Yeah.
No, it's funny because your background is in marketing, right? Why the transition, if it is one, or connection to this subset of study that you seem to have landed on?
Well, I was before I got into marketing. in a sense, I was doing some marketing. I worked for General Motors. I was an engineer. Um, and I went to night school to get my second master's in MBA. And I had an old professor there, who's long ago passed away. Ferdinand Mauser was his name. And he encouraged me to think about going on for a doctorate because I really like to write. And I like to combine quantitative methods with behavioral science. And the so I went on to Northwestern, and that's when Sidney Levy, my mentor there, um, along with the structure of Northwestern, although they didn't publicize it, allowed a person to obtain their PhD from the graduate school. So in a sense, my PhD wasn't, even though I was in the business school or management school, as they called it then, specializing to a certain extent in marketing, um, I was following the classic pattern that was allowed by Northwestern, but seldom practiced. And my dissertation advisor had gone through a similar education himself long, long ago, 1940s, at the University of Chicago. Was called, I think, the Committee on Human Development, which was an interdisciplinary basic discipline type of program. So I studied philosophy, psychology, anthropology, sociology, statistics, and the business subjects as well, of course. But doing that, I didn't define myself as just a marketing professor. I was more, the title I used was a behavioral science in management, where management is the general business function. And so I focused on behavioral science. And when you are trained in many behavioral sciences and continue reading reading the literature, you get ideas all the time. And business is a is a big human behavior that involves sociology, psychology, economics, um, and I saw it as more a laboratory, and the 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 scientific problems that were popping up that I had been, in a sense, trained and appreciated were driving my behavior. And the business schools allowed me to do that as long as I still published some marketing, which I did and do. So I didn't find myself only as a marketer. I find myself as a kind of behavioral scientist studying human behavior, interested in, especially in human emotions, happiness. Um, and it was kind of a natural development. It wasn't a conscious formal planning, but it just happened. And so many of my publications are in the basic disciplines because um, that's where they fit. And then sometimes I'm applying that basic discipline knowledge in marketing. So I study consumer behavior a lot, but I also study the behavior of salespeople psychologically. And even I use the classic methods of questionnaires and that people fill out and express their thoughts and feelings and why they're doing what they're doing. But I also use functional magnetic resonance imagery. I look inside the brains of consumers and managers one at a time in a machine and experimentally give them stimuluses. And I measure these theory of mind and emotional processes that go on in their brains, and I relate it to their everyday behavior, consumer behavior, their sales management behavior. And I do the same sometimes working with hormones and sometimes also working with genetics, where I look at genes, um, neurotransmitter genes and the interaction with psychological variables. So that's very basic research. And I had no training in it. I kind of developed it over the many years and learned it and then started doing it. And so the boundaries, I haven't thought about the boundaries. And there's nothing wrong with being a marketing professor and focusing one's whole self on marketing. And I really respect people that do that, but it just wasn't me. I was broadly trained, cross disciplines. This is part of a family tradition. both sides of my family of origins. My on the Italian side, part of the culture was they talked about Leonardo da Vinci was a hero. So the curiosity and creativity of Leonardo da Vinci was pounded into me, so to speak, but not consciously. It was part of the culture. Or Michelangelo, his dedication and commitment and discipline. He would paint or sculptor all day long from early morning into the evening until he was physically exhausted, and then he would jump into bed with his boots on. This was kind of the culture I grew up in on the Italian side, and then on my mother's side, the Humboldt brothers and Goethe, who I don't know, they talked about the love of humanities and the joy of discovery, and advocacy for thinking across disciplines, self-renewal. I mean, these are all those principles from the early 1800s that they were promoting, and that was part of my culture from my mother's family. And those things really shaped me. So I was really lucky to have been at a university that allowed me to have this kind of interdisciplinary approach and to have a dissertation advisor who fostered and nurtured that. And then so I continued that. Once I graduated from the doctoral program, I looked back and I thought, I'm so grateful for everything I've learned, and I didn't have to pay for it. The university pays for that. And in the dissertation, and I thought, well, why can't I, for the rest of my life, do a dissertation now and then? And I did a maybe 12, speaking figuratively, metaphorically. But that was part of the self-renewal and dedication to scholarship. And that was very important revelation. And so looking back now, 47 years, that's what I've been doing.
Well, Professor, this has been incredibly insightful and interesting, and I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I hope it's helpful. And if people want to contact me anytime to just talk about it, or things to read and things like that, I'm open to do that. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.